All right, so this is DBQ document 5, and then we're going to look at three different pictures, depictions of the Boston Massacre. Now, I know that you may have initially skipped over this particular page, but this page is really important. It gives a lot of important background about the Boston Massacre. And it goes back and gives you some background even prior to the Boston Massacre so that you understand where we're talking about here. So, um, if you remember back to, I'm going to scroll here for just a second. If you remember back to this map, Boston was actually the only city that we looked at that was considered a patriot stronghold. All of the other major cities in the colonies were considered loyalist strongholds. That makes Boston a pretty unique place. And so it really sets up a lot of what we're talking about here. Um, it mentions right here, a lot of British soldiers were moved into the colonies to fight the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War ends, and they don't move them out of the colonies. The king leaves them there, and so that makes a lot of the colonists very resentful that now there's this standing army, this military presence in the colony. A lot of the elite and the wealthy, especially, did not appreciate that the British soldiers were there, and they have these sort of derogatory names for them, lobsterbacks. One thing that kind of gets left behind or not talked about very often is that they actually competed for jobs with the soldiers. Being a British soldier was not a full-time job, or at least it wasn't a full-time job that was enough to really pay the bills. And so they're actually competing with jobs in the harbor and around town with these British soldiers. And so that is another thing that they really resent, that these seemingly just these British soldiers are taking their jobs. Um, and so on March 5th, 1770, so it's still very cold in Boston. It's a snowy time. There's snow on the ground. And this is a good 6+ years before the Declaration of Independence, 5 years before any fighting will start. So we're still talking pretty early on. Um, these soldiers come to stand guard at the customs house. Now, a customs house is where um, goods would have been exchanged. So, like if I'm bringing in goods, or I am myself coming into Boston for the first time from a foreign area, I'm going to go by the customs house. And now, then there was this gang of civilians. There was this group of just everyday Bostonians who were pretty drunk after having left this tavern. And so they get there, it's dark, it gets dark early because it's wintertime and it's Boston. And they start throwing snowballs, and then they start putting rocks in snowballs, and they're throwing horse manure, and they're throwing whatever they can to kind of antagonize the soldiers. Again, they're drunk. Bad idea, right? All the way around. And the captain, the person who's in charge of these soldiers, is trying to control the crowd and trying to control his soldiers. And he's telling his soldiers, don't fire. But you can understand how an order, it's loud and there's commotion and there's people moving around and lots of screaming and shouting, and he screams, "Don't fire!" And you can understand how instead a soldier might hear only the second word there, "fire," and so they fire on the crowd, and 5 people died. So 5 people die, and it gets painted as the Boston Massacre. Or if we look at this first painting, and this is from Paul Revere. This is like the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, one if by land, two if by sea, same guy. You can see at the top, and this was printed in a newspaper. You can see at the top it's called the Bloody Massacre, as Paul Revere coins it. And you can see the soldiers are all in a line here. They all appear to be firing on the innocent civilians as the civilians are fleeing. Here's the captain, and his sword is forward, indicating that he is giving them an order, a command to fire. One interesting note right here, not terribly significant to the story, but just kind of interesting to note, is that the sign right here actually says Butcher's Hall, and that was intentional by Paul Revere. That was an allusion that he left in, basically, implying that the British had been butchering their soldiers. So, Paul Revere publishes this, and this is amounts to nothing short of propaganda. This is an incredibly fictionalized take of what actually happened. But Paul Revere is a patriot, and he has a vested interest in making it look worse than it was and getting people to his side. So he really used this event as propaganda. Here's the second of the two pictures, and I'm gonna just see, rotate it there so we can see it a little bit better. And this one you get a completely different look. Now, right here, you can see there's a few soldiers with their guns pointed out. There's this guy right here. He looks kind of concerned. Here is Captain Preston, and you can see his hands extended, and he is telling his soldiers, "Don't shoot." And his sword is down. Now, this is a completely different view than the one that you got in Paul Revere's broadside, his painting, his engraving, whatever. You've got the protesters. Quite a few of them look very angry. This guy's got a stick and he's about to come and hit the soldiers. So in this case, it could really be argued as self-defense. These are two very, very, very differing sides of the story. And then we've got the third one here. Now, this third one was printed well after the event. This third one was actually not published until actually shortly before the Civil War. And in this one, you've got you've got the soldiers firing. You've got this guy, this soldier. He appears to have been perhaps knocked down. You've got a patriot with a club here. You've got soldiers coming out of the customs house here. And then this guy in the middle, right here, he is an important figure. His name is Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was a lot of historians, a lot of people consider him the first person to die in the Revolutionary War. Now, of course, the war hadn't started yet, but you could argue that his death was kind of the first ripple that led to the wave that became the Revolutionary War. So he is sort of known historically as the first person to die in the Revolutionary War. Attucks was a former slave. You can tell he is African American. And it's interesting to note that he is featured front and center. He's the first thing that your eye kind of gets drawn to in this picture. This picture was made right before the Civil War, and that is not an accident that he would be smack dab in the middle. Really, this is all, in a lot of ways, this is sort of showing the cruelty of just people in general towards African Americans in American history. And so Attucks being the first person to die is not accidental. So there are three different takes on the Boston Massacre, and they're obviously incredibly unique and very different. And this is just a very brief cursory overview of these three different pictures, and you can find a lot more information on them online if you choose to use this document. All right, that's document 5.